1. Tommaso Buscetta, the man whose mouth was worth more than any boss's gun. Tommaso Buscetta did not hold a title of particular rank within the Sicilian Mafia. He was a member of the Porta Nuova family, a soldier who had operated across 3 continents and survived 2 mafia wars by the time he was arrested in Brazil in 1983. His bosses, a succession of men in Palermo, had commanded his loyalty for decades. They assumed that loyalty was unconditional. It was not. What Buscetta possessed, and what no boss in Sicily fully appreciated until it was deployed against them, was a comprehensive understanding of Cosa Nostra's internal structure that spanned families, continents, and decades of operation. He had attended meetings with leadership across the organization. He had conducted business in the United States, Brazil, and across Europe. He understood the commission, the relationships between families, the financial networks, and the identities of members at every level. He carried inside his memory an organizational blueprint that no single boss possessed in its entirety. When Buscetta made the decision to cooperate with Judge Giovanni Falcone in 1984, nay, he did not offer fragments. He delivered the architecture. His testimony provided the structural foundation for the Maxi trial of 1986 and 1987, which prosecuted 475 members of the Sicilian Mafia and secured 338 convictions. No boss in the history of the Sicilian Mafia, through any act of violence or strategic brilliance, had ever inflicted damage of that magnitude on the organization. Buscetta accomplished it by talking. The men who had commanded him could order killings. He could dismantle the institution itself. 2. Abe Reles, the executioner who could have destroyed the entire national crime syndicate. Abe Reles had been the most productive killer in Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm that handled contract killings across the northeastern United States for the combined Italian and Jewish crime syndicates throughout the 1930s. He reported to Louis Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. He was, by formal hierarchy, a subordinate. By operational reality, he was the man who made the organization's most critical function work. When Reles was arrested in 1940 and chose to cooperate, the men above him discovered the true dimensions of the problem. Reles did not merely know about his own killings. He knew about the structure that assigned them, the chain of authorization, the relationships between the men who ordered and the men who executed. His testimony led directly to the conviction and execution of Louis Buchalter, the only major American crime syndicate leader ever put to death by the state. He provided evidence against Albert Anastasia that prosecutors were preparing to bring to trial. He was, while breathing, the single greatest threat to the leadership of organized crime in America. On November 12, 1941, Reles fell from a window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he was being held under police protection. 6 officers were assigned to guard him. None could explain what had happened. The official ruling was suicide, later amended to accidental death. The case against Anastasia collapsed. The men above Reles had been more powerful than him in one specific respect. They could reach him even inside protective custody. But the fact that they needed to kill him, that his continued existence represented a greater organizational threat than the loss of any individual boss, demonstrated precisely where the real power had resided. 3. Sammy Gravano, the underboss who brought down the Teflon Don. Sammy Gravano's formal position in the Gambino family was underboss, second to John Gotti. In the organizational chart, Gotti was the authority. Gravano served at his pleasure. The FBI recordings from the Ravenite Social Club captured Gotti discussing Gravano in terms that made clear Gotti viewed himself as the dominant figure in the relationship. He criticized Gravano's businesses, questioned his judgment, spoke about him with the casual contempt of a man who believed his subordinate had no options. Gotti had miscalculated. Gravano had participated personally in 19 murders. He had managed the family's construction rackets, overseen internal discipline, and built relationships across the organization that were independent of Gotti's patronage. When prosecutors played those Ravenite recordings for Gravano in custody, and he heard what his boss had said about him, his decision to cooperate was not an act of weakness. It was a recognition that he possessed something Gotti could not survive. Gravano's testimony over 9 days in 1992 provided the operational detail that no surveillance recording could match. He described the authorization chain for specific murders, the financial structure of the family's rackets, and the internal politics that connected every significant decision to Gotti personally. Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts and sentenced to life without parole. The boss, who had believed his underboss was a manageable subordinate, discovered that the man who had carried out the work understood the organization more completely than the man who had given the orders. 4. Frank Sheeran, the man who did what Jimmy Hoffa's enemies needed done. Frank Sheeran was a soldier in the Bufalino crime family under Russell Bufalino, a boss who cultivated obscurity as a survival strategy and operated one of the most discreet organizations in American criminal history. Sheeran's value to Bufalino and to the broader network of relationships Bufalino maintained was not his rank, it was his access. Sheeran had built a relationship with Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters that was personal, sustained, and trusted. He had served as Hoffa's bodyguard, confidant, and enforcer for labor-related operations. When Hoffa became a problem for the organized crime figures who controlled the Teamsters pension fund, so the men who needed Hoffa eliminated required someone Hoffa would trust enough to follow into a room without suspicion. That requirement narrowed the field to one person. Sheeran claimed in his final years, and investigators considered credible, that he had shot Jimmy Hoffa on July 30, 1975, in a house in Detroit. Forensic evidence recovered in 2004 was consistent with his account. Bufalino had given the order, but the order was meaningless without Sheeran specifically. No other member of any family possessed the personal relationship necessary to execute it. For that single operation, Sheeran held power that no boss, including Bufalino, could replicate or substitute. The most consequential mob hit in American history required one specific man, and that man was not the boss. 5. Richard Kuklinski, the contractor no family could afford to lose. Richard Kuklinski worked for the Gambino, Genovese, and De Cavalcante families simultaneously across 2 decades. He reported in a formal sense to whichever captain or boss had contracted his services for a given assignment. In practice, he reported to none of them. His operational independence was itself a form of power that none of his nominal superiors possessed in relation to him. He claimed over 100 murders. Investigators confirmed far fewer, but acknowledged the real number was significantly higher than the documented record. His methods, which included cyanide administered through nasal spray, crossbow killings, and the freezing of bodies in industrial units to corrupt time-of-death estimates, were techniques no family had developed internally. He was a specialist whose expertise could not be replicated by any soldier within any of the organizations that employed him. That irreplaceability gave Kuklinski a position that defied the hierarchy entirely. Bosses needed him to remain available. They needed his methods to remain undetected. They needed the problems he solved to stay solved. For the duration of his operational period, the men who gave him assignments depended on him more than he depended on any single one of them. He could lose a client. They could not easily replace the service. 6. Roy DeMeo, the Gambino's most valuable asset and greatest liability. Roy DeMeo operated a crew out of the Gemini Lounge in Canarsie, Brooklyn, that was simultaneously the Gambino family's most prolific killing operation and one of its highest-earning stolen car enterprises. He reported to Nino Gaggi, and through Gaggi to Paul Castellano. In the hierarchy, DeMeo was a soldier. In operational terms, he was something closer to indispensable. His crew killed between 75 and 200 people using the Gemini method, a systemized disposal process that eliminated bodies so effectively that many victims were never reported missing, let alone found. His stolen car operation shipped vehicles to the Middle East and generated revenue that the Gambino leadership depended on. He combined 2 functions, enforcement and earning, at a level of productivity that no one else in the organization could match. Castellano understood DeMeo's value and also understood the problem his value created. A soldier that productive, that violent, and that operationally autonomous was a structural threat to the hierarchy itself. DeMeo knew too much about too many operations. His crew had killed too many people with too many connections. When Castellano ordered DeMeo killed in January 1983, it was not because DeMeo had failed. It was because DeMeo had succeeded on a scale that made him more dangerous to his own boss than any rival family was. The most useful man in the Gambino organization became, through the sheer extent of his usefulness, the man the organization most needed to eliminate. 7. Anthony Casso, the boss who was also his own best killer. Anthony Casso ran the Lucchese family jointly with Vittorio Amuso and admitted to personal participation in 36 murders. Most bosses at his level gave orders and maintained distance. Casso gave orders and then with regularity went himself. That dual capacity, near administrative authority, combined with a demonstrated willingness to personally execute violence, gave him a concentration of power within the Lucchese family that Amuso, his co-leader, could not match. Casso's additional advantage was intelligence. 2 corrupt NYPD detectives, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Ippolito, sold him operational information on witnesses, targets, and active investigations. No other boss had ever possessed that capability. Casso knew when to move, when to wait, and who was talking. He combined the authority to order a killing with the intelligence to identify the target and the willingness to carry it out personally. That convergence made him, during his operational peak, arguably more powerful than any individual within the Lucchese family's history, including the men whose name it bore. 8. Charles Carneglia, the disposal specialist who made John Gotti's problems disappear. Charles Carneglia operated in Gotti's inner circle, as a man whose function was specific and whose value derived entirely from the completeness with which he performed it. His junkyard in East New York, where prosecutors established that victims were dissolved in acid barrels, eliminated the evidence problem entirely. No body, no physical evidence, no witness willing to speak. Gotti could order a killing. Any number of men in his organization could carry one out, but the gap between a completed killing and a case that could never be built was Carneglia's contribution. He operated for 3 decades without a major prosecution, a run that reflected the thoroughness of his methods and the extent to which the organization's legal survival depended on his work. Without Carneglia's disposal capability, the Gambino family's exposure to prosecution would have been fundamentally different. The man who ensured that investigations never found anything to investigate held a form of power that his boss, for all his visibility and authority, could not replicate. 9. Giovanni Brusca, the button man who shaped Italian history. Giovanni Brusca was a senior enforcer for the Corleonesi faction of the Sicilian Mafia under Salvatore Riina. He admitted to between 100 and 200 murders. His rank was subordinate to Riina's. His impact on the trajectory of the organization and on Italy itself was not. Brusca was the man who pressed the detonator on May 23, 1992, that killed Judge Giovanni Falcone, his wife, and 3 police escorts. He participated in the Via D'Amelio bombing 57 days later that killed Judge Paolo Borsellino and 5 bodyguards. In a single summer, operating under Riina's orders, Brusca helped eliminate the 2 most effective anti-mafia prosecutors in Italian history. Those assassinations triggered a national response that ultimately destroyed the Corleonese's dominance and led to Riina's arrest. The man who pressed the button executed his boss's will so effectively that the consequences annihilated the organization that had issued the order. The enforcer's operational competence exceeded his boss's strategic judgment. That imbalance proved fatal for both. 10. Joseph Barbosa, New England's most feared man, including by his own boss. Joseph Barbosa worked for Raymond Patriarca, the Providence boss who controlled organized crime across New England for decades. Patriarca used Barbosa for specific assignments precisely because Barbosa was willing to resolve problems with a totality that other men in the organization could not deliver. He admitted to 26 murders and was suspected in significantly more. The paradox of Barbosa's position was that the qualities that made him useful made him uncontrollable. He was enormously strong, trained in boxing, and psychologically indifferent to consequence in ways that allowed him to succeed where others failed, but also made him a permanent source of organizational risk. Patriarca needed him and feared what he was in roughly equal measure. When Barbosa eventually cooperated with federal prosecutors and entered witness protection, his testimony damaged the Patriarca organization in ways that no rival family had ever managed. The boss who had used him as a weapon discovered that the weapon could be redirected. A man that dangerous does not stop being dangerous when he changes sides. 11. Harry Strauss, Murder Incorporated's apex predator. Harry Strauss operated under the authority of Louis Buchalter and Albert Anastasia within the Murder Incorporated structure. Conservative estimates placed his confirmed kills at 28. Investigators who worked the prosecutions believed the actual number fell between 100 and 500. That range reflected not ambiguity about whether Strauss killed, but ambiguity about how many unsolved homicides across 6 or more states could be attributed to him specifically. Strauss never carried a weapon when he traveled for a job. He obtained and disposed of tools locally, crossing state lines clean and arriving with nothing that connected him to the work. He was arrested 18 times during his operational period and convicted of nothing. The infrastructure that Buchalter and Anastasia had built, the organizational framework of Murder Incorporated, relied on men like Strauss for its fundamental product. Without killers of his reliability and craft, the enterprise had nothing to sell. The bosses provided the contracts, Strauss provided the capability. And capability, in an organization whose sole purpose was killing, was the scarcest and most valuable resource. 12. Tommy DeSimone, the uncontrollable asset. Tommy DeSimone was an associate of the Lucchese family who operated under Paul Vario's crew in Queens. He participated in the 1978 Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport. He was connected to murders spanning more than a decade. Joe Pesci's portrayal of him in Goodfellas, which earned an Academy Award, was not considered by those who knew DeSimone to be an exaggeration. What made DeSimone a form of power unto himself was the quality that also made him unsustainable. He killed without authorization, in anger, in the moment, without the permissions and vetting that the hierarchy required. That unpredictability terrified the men around him, including the men above him. Vario could not fully control DeSimone, and that inability was itself a redistribution of power. A subordinate who might kill anyone at any time, regardless of authorization, holds a kind of authority that no organizational chart accounts for. The men in his crew, so and the men adjacent to it, calibrated their behavior around Desimone's volatility. He shaped the environment through the threat of what he might do, not through any formal position. His bosses eventually had him killed, not because he had disobeyed a specific order, but because the cumulative weight of his uncontrollability had become a structural problem that could only be resolved one way. 13. Carmine Galante, the underboss who tried to take everything. Carmine Galante had served as underboss of the Bonanno family and had spent 12 years in federal prison for narcotics trafficking before his release in 1974. Upon returning to the streets, he began consolidating control of the heroin trade in ways that bypassed the commission entirely. He imported Sicilian operatives, known as Zips, Han, who reported directly to him and whose loyalty was to Galante personally rather than to the Bonanno hierarchy. His narcotics operation generated revenue that dwarfed what the family's official boss controlled. His imported Sicilians gave him an enforcement capability independent of the family's existing crew structure. He was building, in practical terms, a parallel organization within the Bonanno family that answered to him and only to him. The commission recognized what was happening. On July 12, 1979, Galante was shot and killed at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. He was found with a cigar still in his mouth. The assassination was authorized by the commission itself, a collective decision by the bosses of the other families that Galante's accumulation of independent power had become intolerable. He had been killed not for failing the hierarchy, but for rendering it irrelevant. 14. John Martirano, the Winter Hill Gang's indispensable weapon. John Martirano killed 20 people between 1965 and 1982 and disclosed this in a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. He delivered the admission without visible remorse, and investigators considered the number a flaw. He operated for Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi across nearly 2 decades, and the violence he delivered was so consistent that it became, within the Winter Hill Gang's operations, a logistical resource. Martirano's power relative to Bulger and Flemmi derived from a specific asymmetry. The leadership needed him more than he needed the leadership. His calm, his reliability, and his willingness to complete assignments without complication or psychological residue made him the operational foundation upon which the gang's enforcement reputation rested. When Martirano eventually learned that Bulger had been an FBI informant throughout their entire association, and that Bulger's handler had been using information from the gang to advance the FBI's priorities, Martirano cooperated with prosecutors and provided testimony that helped convict both Bulger and Flemmi. The enforcer, who had spent decades serving the leadership, discovered that the leadership had been serving someone else entirely. His response dismantled the organization. 15. Filippo Marchione, the Camorra enforcer who held Naples in fear. Filippo Marchione operated as a senior enforcer for the Secondigliano Alliance, a Camorra network that controlled narcotics distribution across large sections of Naples and its surrounding territory through the 1990s and 2000s. His bosses managed the financial architecture. Marchione managed what happened to people who interfered with it. His reputation within the Neapolitan underworld was not dependent on his superiors. It was personal, built through a record of violence that associates described as swift and total. Anti-mafia prosecutors in Naples identified him as the operational figure most responsible for maintaining the alliance's territorial control during periods when the formal leadership was imprisoned or in hiding. When the bosses were removed, the organization continued to function because men like Marchione ensured it did. His power was structural rather than titular. He held the territory, and without territory, the bosses held nothing. 16. Anthony Center, the Gemini crew's quiet professional. Anthony Center was, by every account that emerged from the Gambino family prosecutions, the more contained of the 2 men who formed the operational core of Roy DeMio's crew. His confirmed participation in at least 28 murders was described by investigators as a flaw. He helped DeMio perfect the Gemini method until the process was frictionless, and he was dispatched for specific assignments with a consistency that made him the most reliable enforcement resource the crew possessed. When Paul Castellano ordered DeMio killed, Center was almost certainly among the men who carried it out. The operational reliability that had defined his career under DeMio transferred seamlessly to the service of the boss who had ordered DeMio's elimination. He served the function, not the man. That distinction, the ability to remain indispensable, regardless of who occupied the top of the chart, was a form of power that outlasted any individual boss's authority. 17. Benedetto Santapaula, the Catanian boss who answered to no one in practice. Benedetto Santapaula ran the Catania family of the Sicilian Mafia with a degree of autonomy that made his nominal subordination to Palermo largely theoretical. While Totoriina and the Corleonesi controlled the commission and demanded obedience from the island's families, Santapaula maintained independent relationships with South American drug networks that gave gave him financial resources not dependent on Palermo's approval. He was convicted of multiple murders, including involvement in the 1982 assassination of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, Italy's top anti-mafia official at the time. His enforcement capabilities in eastern Sicily were his own, not borrowed from the Corleonesi. When Riena's strategy of direct confrontation with the Italian state proved catastrophic after the Falcone and Borsellino assassinations, Santa Paola's independent power base allowed him to survive the collapse that destroyed the men who had theoretically been his superiors. The man who had nominally answered to Palermo outlasted Palermo's leadership because his power had never actually depended on them. 18. Gerard Papa, the Colombo family's most dangerous soldier. Gerard Papa was a soldier in the Colombo family who operated across the boundary lines that normally separated New York's 5 families. He killed for the Colombos, the Genovese family, and occasionally for independent contractors who needed his specific capabilities. His confirmed kills numbered at least 16. Investigators believed the actual number was significantly higher. Papa's cross-family utility gave him a network of relationships and obligations that no single boss fully controlled. He was owed favors across organizational lines. He possessed information about operations in multiple families. He was, in practical terms, more connected than any individual captain or underboss within the Colombo hierarchy. That position made him valuable and dangerous in equal measure. He was killed in 1980, almost certainly on orders from within his own organization. The decision reflected a calculation that had governed the disposal of powerful killers throughout mafia history. A man whose connections and capabilities exceeded his rank was a man whose continued existence the hierarchy could not afford. 19. Luciano Liggio, the killer who seized an entire family by force. Luciano Liggio did not wait for the hierarchy to grant him power. He took it. Born in Corleone, Sicily, he began his criminal career as an enforcer for the local mafia boss, Michele Navarra. By the mid-1950s, Liggio had concluded that working under Navarra's authority was an arrangement he intended to terminate. On August 2, 1958, Liggio organized the ambush of Navarra's car on a rural road outside Corleone. Navarra was hit with 92 bullets. The killing was not merely a succession, it was a declaration that the traditional rules governing leadership transition, the requirement for commission approval, the protocols of internal mediation, did not apply to Liggio because Liggio possessed the capacity to disregard them and survive the consequences. He subsequently built the Corleonesi faction into the dominant force in the Sicilian Mafia, a position later inherited by his protege Salvatore Riina. The entire Corleonesi era, which would reshape the Sicilian Mafia for decades, originated in a single enforcer's decision that his own boss was an obstacle rather than an authority. 20. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner who answered only to fear. Albert Anastasia occupied the position of Operational Director of Murder Incorporated from its formation in the early 1930s through its exposure in 1941, overseeing an enterprise that historians estimate killed between 400 and 1,000 people on contract. He reported formally to the Commission. He served formally at the pleasure of the National Crime Syndicate's collective leadership. In practice, the men who sat on that commission were afraid of him. He had been convicted of murder in 1921 and sentenced to death, then won a retrial after all 4 prosecution witnesses disappeared. He was one of the 4 men who killed Joe Masseria in 1931. He eliminated his own boss, Vincent Mangano, in 1951 to take direct control of the family. The pattern was consistent across 3 decades. Anastasia removed obstacles to his authority through violence, and the organizational structures that should have constrained him were insufficient to do so because the men who administered those structures understood what he was. His assassination at the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop on October 25, 1957, required the coordinated agreement of multiple commission members and was executed with a level of planning that reflected the genuine danger of attempting to kill him. The effort needed to remove Anastasia was itself the final proof of his power. He had been for 30 years the man in the New York underworld that other dangerous men were afraid of. That distinction in an environment populated entirely by killers required something specific to sustain. He sustained it without visible effort until the collective cost of allowing him to continue exceeded the collective risk of attempting to stop him. Every organization draws a chart, titles at the top, soldiers at the bottom, clean lines connecting one to the other. The chart says who gives orders and who follows them. What it does not say, what it has never been able to account for, is where the actual power sits. These 20 men demonstrated that power in a criminal organization does not reside permanently in a title or a position. It resides in capability, in knowledge, in the willingness to do specific things that other men cannot or will not do. The bosses understood this. Many of them had risen to their positions through exactly the same qualities they now saw in the men below them. The hierarchy was a management tool, not a description of reality. And the men on this list, the killers, the enforcers, the disposal specialists, the men who carried the organization's secrets in their heads and its violence in their hands, understood that the distance between serving the boss and replacing the boss was, in most cases, a matter of timing and decision. Several of them closed that distance. The rest were eliminated before they could. That is the arithmetic of power inside every criminal organization that has ever existed. The chart says one thing. The men in the room know another.